Hey, Amy, Tommy here. Great to have you in another class and hope life is good in Cairo. I know things have been tense in your region in the last, oh my God, uh, 18 months almost. And so thinking of you along those lines, and I thought some of the stuff we read and that you've highlighted in your responses this first week maybe shed some light on Christian witness in the Middle East these days, especially if you're familiar with some of the political contours of Christianity in the United States. Just cutting right to the heart of it, first of all, the people of God certainly includes the Jewish community and irrevocably, we might say, in the Bible, but not um, to the exclusion of other non-Jewish people that the family of Israel also welcomes into its midst over generations. And that's important that the biblical people of Israel is not reduced to the Jewish population of a modern nation state or other people that they claim around the world. We could also maybe highlight the way that enjoying uh, the land is a matter of a blessing that God gives and that depends on the way that the people of Israel live in the land. It's not an inalienable right, you might say. Israel is not entitled to live in the land of promise, regardless of how they treat one another or treat others who live there or elsewhere. So anyway, lots of things that I hope will help us as we navigate the geopolitics of our day in relation to the memory of the biblical people of God, so that we don't continue to reinforce a sort of mythology that props up all kinds of unjust arrangements that we should not countenance or tolerate, I don't think, today. So, anyway, that was at the top of my mind, but I want to cut in a little bit more directly to some of the things that you've written in the response forums here, which is excellent. I think that you do a good job of sort of emphasizing that God is not going to give up on the biblical people of Israel. When they're unfaithful, God doesn't sort of disown them or simply uh, kind of disinherit them as no longer the people of God and replace them with new, better, more faithful people. That's not the way Israel works. Instead, God promises to bring them healing. God promises to forgive their sins. God promises to write the law on their hearts. And this way of a kind of relentless faithfulness of God is crucial, I think, to who Jesus is in the Gospel of Matthew. He comes onto the scene in his baptism in solidarity with his people and their sins. He doesn't stand aloof or above his people as if their sins were not his problem. He knows his people's sins only as his own. They're an intergenerational inheritance that he participates in and owns and joins them in proclaiming a commitment to repent from those patterns of injustice and to welcome the kingdom that's coming to the earth from heaven in his generation. And as it turns out, especially through him, as the one that at that very moment of solidarity with his people is anointed by God through the Spirit as the ultimate human heir of God's ruling power on the earth, God's Son. And of course, the way that Jesus rules, the way that he embodies God's rule on the earth is highly peculiar and does not conform to some of the conventions of power that we bring typically to this story. Jesus embodies his own kind of politics, exerts power in his own kind of way. And as disciples of Jesus, that's kind of what we want to learn, partly from this story. And a key dimension of it is his solidarity with people in their sin, as opposed to standing above them and disowning them when they are unfaithful. So, good work on the question of who Israel is. I love some of the highlights you've drawn from Jesus's pre-story and the genealogy, as we're calling it. Um, I think that you associate rightly Jesus's healing of the sick, feeding the hungry, with the promises that were made to his ancestors about peace The peace that is promised in the prophets is robust. It entails all kinds of bodily particulars of people's lives. It's not just the absence of war, though it certainly is that too. It is the communication of their bodies, the wholeness of their relationships with one another. This is key to the hope of the prophets and what Jesus embodies by his healing power. And that's evoked by the way that peace is part of the memory of the names that are mentioned in the genealogy. You, I think, rightly also in the second paragraph, sort of name that the exile to Babylon is a key to who Jesus is. He is the son of exile and all of the consequences of that. He's the son, as you say, of struggle and the hope that comes only from struggle. That's not a cheap hope. It's a hope that is chastened and shaped and tested by all kinds of suffering. And that's also something to which Jesus's Gentile mothers or mothers with Gentile associations bear witness to. They're mistreated by powerful Israelite men in many cases, men of renown. And here God is vindicating them as mothers not only of David, the first three, but also of the Messiah of Israel that is the hope of all the peoples of the world. You do say you want to get more into this issue of Gentile inclusion. I kind of question the usual way that we have conceived of that in Matthew's gospel, as well as the rest of the New Testament. And a little preview there. Usually, Gentile inclusion is thought of as just like supposedly it wasn't happening before Jesus comes along, and Jesus is like suddenly really generous and hospitable, whereas other people before him in Israel weren't. That just won't work. That's a kind of cheap Gentile inclusion. We see all kinds of ways in which Gentile people are woven into Israel's life, welcomed in the past of Israel, and yet there remains this kind of hostility that affects the relationship between Israel and Gentile peoples. And what Jesus does is, I would say, express and address that hostility. He doesn't pretend it's not there. He doesn't pretend that he's not an heir to it. He doesn't pretend that Israel is not threatened by Gentile peoples. Instead, he sort of does the hard work of addressing what is ill in Israel's life and affects its relationships with Gentile peoples, and then begins to touch that hostile boundary. We see it the most directly, maybe, in his encounter with the Canaanite mother in Matthew 15. It's a tense encounter. It's not a cheap welcome that Jesus gives her, but she, like his other Gentile mothers, fights for her future. And Jesus yields to her. He honors her witness. And this, I think, is key to who he is as the Messiah. He's not just, you might say, the author of all of the good future that comes to Israel and Gentile peoples. He's also a witness to the good things that God gives to Gentile peoples, like the faith of this Canaanite mother that wins a future of welcome between Israel and people like her who are Israel's most proverbial and bitter enemies, and yet here seen in Matthew 15 as effectively sharing a table with Jesus. But it's a difficult journey to get there, and I think that's what I'm getting at in terms of how people are included. Often I want to say when we talk about inclusion these days, because it's such a trendy term, included in what? A lot of Christians want to be inclusive, and I suppose that's good so far as it goes, but often the life that we're living together is not really one that people would want to be included in. And that's also true of Jesus's community. To include Gentiles in it without addressing the brokenness, the disease that is in his community would not be inclusion enough. And so we see Jesus also addressing the wounds of his people that make their community inhospitable, not only to Gentiles, but to one another. And at the same time, then addressing that hostility and sin and injustice and idolatry that is also present in Gentile people's lives, although that is featured much less directly in Matthew's gospel. Anyway, mouthful, but hopefully this gets our conversation off to a good start. Thanks for your good work in week one. I see some of the what shall we say, the wisdom that I think you gained from the way you've studied New Testament already in previous courses at Fuller and probably just in your own Christian formation. So it's always good to see that, and looking forward to more conversation in the weeks ahead.